In this video, we're going to talk about trade blocks. And what do we mean by trade blocks? Well, talking about things like free trade areas, customs unions, and the like. In the book, it gives a nice little summary of what these different types of organizations are. Of course, the simplest is the free trade area, right? And you should all be familiar with free trade areas, if for no other reason than you've heard of NAFTA, right? Which we're giving a whole different new name to. The USMCA, right? The US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, at least that's what we're calling it. In Canada, they're giving it a different name because apparently their laws do not allow a trade agreement to start with another country's name. Be that as it may, it's all the same thing, right? We're talking about free trade areas. Now, the WTO takes a positive view of free trade areas so long as the formation of a free trade area doesn't cause the external tariffs and trade barriers to go up. With the notion that anything that reduces trade barriers overall must be a good thing for trade. However, what we're going to show here with some examples is that we have to take into account the possibility of trade diversion, right? And set that against what we call trade creation, right? So the notion is, look, if we're lowering trade barriers, that should lead to more trade, right? Trade creation. And ultimately, we'll see with these examples that we do get more imports. The question is, how much of that addition, right, that increase in imports is due to just importing more from, and how much are we just diverting trade from one trade partner to another? So let's take an example here. We're using, again, the example in the book. And here we're going to look at the prospect of the UK, right, forming a trade agreement. And so you can imagine here, this was the before the EU, right, before the UK joining the EU and trying to decide whether they should be in the EU. And of course, now we have Brexit, right? We have the UK leaving the EU. So you can actually take the analysis that we're going to do right here and run it all in reverse for Brexit, right? So whatever effects we have of the UK joining the EU, well, everything happens in the opposite direction when they leave the EU. So keep that in mind as we're working through these two different examples we're going to show here, and think about how this analysis would apply to the impending Brexit. Okay? So we're going to look at two scenarios here. Okay? It's both the same basic idea, the UK joining the EU, and it's going to be the market for automobiles, and the UK is going to import autos. But we're going to have two different scenarios in terms of the net outcomes here. Okay? And so here we have, I'm going to have a couple different prices. So here is the demand curve, and this is just the UK market for autos. Okay? To make the example really simple, to make it much easier to work through, we're just going to say that there's no domestic production of automobiles, right? This way we don't even have to worry about tracking the UK, the domestic producer surplus. And I'm going to make it really simple. One way to think about it is that their price is just so high, right, that any potential producers of automobiles in the UK are just priced out completely. So what we're going to have here is they could buy automobiles from within the EU or outside of the EU, or from EU countries or non-EU countries. And so let's say that what you have here, so I'm going to have the two countries, and so this is in pounds. Okay? So let's say the price of Japanese autos. Okay, so that's going to be our country outside of the EU. Price of Japanese autos is 5,000. Okay, 5,000 pounds. And the price of German autos, in case you haven't heard, Germany does make some good cars. Right. The price of the German autos is going to be 5,500. Okay, so the German cars are more expensive. And for the sake of this example, right, we'll just say the cars are identical. There's no difference in quality. Just, again, really simplified example to make it a lot easier to analyze. Now, initially what we're going to have here is a tariff of 1,000 pounds. Okay. And initially, this tariff is going to apply to auto imports regardless of origin. Okay, so this is before the UK is in the EU. So what that would do is it would raise the price of Japanese autos to 6,000. And it would raise the price of German autos to 6.5 or 6,500 pounds. So now the question becomes, okay, well, start with before they join the EU. So what are the prices that are relevant? Well, the relevant prices are these 6,500 pounds, because that's going to be the price of a German car with the tariff, or 6,000 pounds, which is the price of the Japanese car with the tariff. Well, clearly, they're going to, right, Brits are going to buy their cars from Japan, because it's they're $500 pounds per car less. And at that price, they're going to end up importing 10,000. Okay. This is in thousands. Now, what happens when Germany or the UK joins the EU and Germany is in the EU? So then what's going to happen is that the tariff's going to stay on the Japanese automobiles. So the price here, the 6,000 is, right? That's going to stay the price of the Japanese autos with the tariffs. But we're removing the tariff on the German automobiles. So from the British consumer's perspective, the price of German autos has now come down to 5,500 pounds. Note here, we're treating the UK as a small country. There's no impact on these base prices. So we end up moving from here down to this point here. And at that lower price, what we end up with is 15, imports of 15,000. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at these changes in the surplus. Right? Well, we go from a price of 6,000 pounds and 10,000 autos imported down to 5.5 and 15,000 imported. Well, so now we have consumers gain A, B, and right, these two areas here, A and B. Right, so the change in consumer surplus is A and B. Right? They're better off with this lower price. There's no domestic UK producer, so we don't have to worry about them. But what's happening? Notice that initially, tariffs, right, the tariff revenue is this shaded, this area that I'm kind of outlining, shading, right? So call it A and C. So initially, tariff revenue is A and C, but now the government's not collecting any tariff revenue because we're importing all of the autos from Germany without tariff. So they're losing, right? The government's losing A and C, so that gives a net effect in the UK, right? The A's cancel, and you're left with B minus C. Well, B is our trade creation effect. Right? That's the increase in the consumer surplus that's coming from the fact that we've increased the amount of imports from 10 to 15,000. Right? And so they're gaining more surplus because they're importing more at this lower price. And C is what we refer to as our trade diversion effect. And that's showing you the lost tariff revenue that's not benefiting the consumers. So really what's at heart here, this trade diversion effect, that's coming from the fact that German producers are not as efficient. They can't produce at as low a cost as the Japanese producers, right? That 500 pound per automobile higher price of the German automobiles, right? That's what's happening is we're now, in the UK, they're importing the more expensive car solely because of the tariff only being applied to the Japanese autos and not to the German autos. And if you look at it in this case, right, and if we actually did the calculation on these areas, right, B would turn out to be much smaller than C. Right? B is 1/2 times 15, or sorry, times 5, 15 minus 10, times 0.5, right, or 500, right? So if you actually do that out here, that's 5. You have 0.5 times 0.5, so it's a quarter of the 5, so half of 5 is 2.5, so that's 1.25. And C, on the other hand, is 10 times 0.5, or 5. So C is much larger than B, so this effect here, right, what you would be seeing here is that the trade diversion dominates trade creation, and the net effect is actually, the net effect is negative for the UK, right? So this is a scenario where actually joining this free trade area, at least in this one market, actually leads to lower overall welfare. But it doesn't have to be that way. So we can let's take another slightly different setup here, and what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that the price difference between the German and the Japanese autos is much smaller. So here we're going to have an initial Japanese price of 5,000. We'll keep that the same. Okay. And again, we'll keep the tariff at 1,000, so that with the tariff, the price of those Japanese autos goes to 6,000. But now what we're going to have, and again we'll keep the initial quantity the same at 10,000 automobiles. But now what we're going to do is we're going to say that, you know what, the German auto producers are not that much more expensive. Okay? So their price is going to be, the base price of the German autos is going to be 5.1 thousand pounds. Okay? So now when we look at it, A and B are here, and C is this much smaller area here, right? The trade diversion effect here is much smaller because we're not, right? Yes, the German producers are still not as efficient as the Japanese producers. Their price is higher, but not that much higher, right? They're only 100 pounds per automobile more rather than 500 pounds per automobile more. So when we divert trade from Japan to Germany, right, from Japanese autos to German autos, we're not losing as much in terms of this inefficiency. On the other hand, right, so this trade diversion effect gets smaller. On the other hand, note that the trade diversion effect, this area B, is much larger because the price drop, right, when we join the EU is much, much bigger now. Right? And so imports will increase by more than they did in our first example on the left. So in this case, where the cost difference between Japanese and German automobiles is much closer than it is in the first example, you get a smaller trade diversion and a much larger trade creation effect. And if you were to actually calculate those areas out, what you would notice is that B is actually much larger than C, so you get a positive net effect of joining the EU. Right? And so these are different scenarios of what you can see. Right? The one big factor that we have to pay attention to is the cost difference between producers, suppliers inside of the free trade area and those outside of the free trade area. The other thing that we can do, and this is what I'd like you to focus on for in class, and we'll discuss this more in class, is how the elasticity of the demand for, in this case, automobiles, how that might affect the relative size of the trade creation and trade diversion effects. Okay? So we'll pick up with this example looking at differences in basically the slope of the demand curve in class.